Welcome everybody to part 2 of our introduction to mapping for community woodland groups. We're delighted to have you back today for the session with Alice Brawley, our Woodland Officer. And this is the second part of a 3-part series. Part 1 is already on YouTube for you to download if you missed that session. We will go through the same process as we did last time. Alice will talk through what she is sharing with us, and we'll have a couple of points during today's hour whereby we'll stop for questions. Please do put your questions in the chat and we can pick them up once we come to that stopping point. And then we'll also have more opportunities for questions at the end as well. Without any further ado, I think, Alice, I'm over to you. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, welcome back everyone, and welcome to those who weren't here last week. Let's get started. So hopefully, yeah, if you didn't attend last week, you will have maybe seen the YouTube recording, but we mainly covered an introduction to what GIS is and why it's useful, and examples of common maps that I think community woodland groups might be wanting to create or needing to create, and then an introduction to some different GIS platforms. You've all just muted yourself, which is very useful, but maybe you can put up your hand. Did anyone try out any of the softwares that we went over last week? A few of you, fab. I guess you could unmute yourself. How did you get on? Do you want to share anything?
I'm actually quite familiar with both programs, but it's quite useful to know what's the most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve.
Great.
I really struggled. I'm trying to use it for quite a specific application, mapping invasive species within a woodland, and I just yeah, I was just having quite a lot of issues using the basic software, so I did have lots of questions, but yeah, I don't want to bore everybody with those.
Which, yeah, well, maybe save them to the end, and also maybe that can be the focus of next week. Which ones did you use, or which one did you use?
So I was following what you suggested. I was trying to use My Forest to create a base map and then import it into Avenza so that I could go on site and pinpoint areas of various invasive species and take photos of it to link to it and then upload it back onto my computer, and I just failed at the first step pretty much.
Yeah, okay, cool, that's good to know. Yeah, my proposal for next week as the software that we go through is to do an example of making a map through My Forest, and then I can't do a live demonstration of Avenza because it's a mobile map, but then to kind of take screenshots and kind of work through the steps, so you kind of have that, because it'll be recorded, you'd kind of have that as a reference. So hopefully, I mean, don't worry if you struggled. Last week was like very, very basic, and so if you have no knowledge of it, then yeah, that's understandable, but good to know that you tried and can hopefully by next week feel more confident. Peter, were you going to say anything? You're muted, Peter. Oh, you're still muted at my end, maybe.
Ah,
there we go. Great.
That should be all right. Sorry, I tried My Forest, and for our woodland to start again, and it just seemed terribly long-winded.
Yeah.
So, but you know, that's the way it is, I think. It's not very intuitive, so but I did manage to sort of get started and have something that I could at least say, oh yes, I think I can see how that works now. But yeah, I look forward to next week and going into more detail.
Yeah, so yeah, this week my aim is to cover kind of like spatial data types and file formats, which is if I'm being completely honest, quite a dry topic, but it's kind of the like foundation to a lot to understanding GIS, and I'm hoping by covering some of it, it'll kind of give you a bit of an understanding of like how these different softwares work, and then we're kind of going on to how to create basic maps and access data, and cover a bit more on copyright, which we introduced last week. And then next week will be the examples. And yeah, if you're struggling, I mean, the way that you get taught it at like a master's level is you literally have tutorials, and they give you printouts and they tell you exactly what to click when, and you have helpers in the workshop sessions, and they're coming around and they're troubleshooting with you when you get stuck, or like telling you where to click. So if you're like struggling, it does just take time, and you do just kind of have to do it and kind of get stuck, and then yeah, ask questions or figure it out. So hopefully next week, by us going through it, that will give you more of a more confidence to be able to get a bit further than you have already. But that's great to hear that some of you have started. That's good. So community woodland mapping, you're most likely going to be opening data and that someone has sent to you, or that your organization, someone out, like a pre-assessor in your organization has already created shapefiles and you want to open them, or you're going to be making maps yourself, or you're going to collect field data, and then you're going to want to use that field data to like update your maps, and then you're also going to want to avoid breaking things and getting angry at the computer. So they're the kind of like overarching aims of your map making. So yeah, the next few slides, will cover some basics, and hopefully, won't get too technical. So in GIS, there's kind of two main spatial models, and by model, I mean how are we like representing the real world in GIS. And I guess your goal is to be able to recognize why we use these two different models and how they behave differently. So the first one is a vector model, and this is where the real world is mapped as points, lines, and polygons. And then the second model is a raster model, which is where the real world is mapped as individual cells. So if we start with the vector model, so points, lines, and polygons, as I just said, are used to represent the real world. So any individual trees in a woodland, or gates or benches, are likely to be mapped as points. Any linear features, such as paths and streams and fences, are going to be mapped as lines. And then any areas in your woodland, so woodland compartments or ownership boundaries, are going to be marked most likely as polygons. And then attached to these features, so attached to your points and your lines and your polygons, is something called attribute data. And this is kind of like a fancy word for that basically just means a description. And without your attribute data, the points and the lines and the polygons are meaningless, and they don't really tell you anything apart from being points, lines, and polygons, and apart from you making like an educated guess on what they are. And this attribute data is often held in a GIS system as like a Excel table, almost, you can imagine it as. So here for the points, I've got an ID, and then I've got a description, which is a title that I've created, and I'm saying the first point that I'm mapping is the hut in the community woodland. And then the next point is the compost toilet. And then the next point might be a musical forest or whatever. And then I wanted to also include information about the year in which these infrastructure were built. So the hut was built in 2016, etc. So it's basically describing the data. And then the same gets done for lines. So I'm given a description to what is line 1, what is line 2, and what is line 3 on the map. And then I'm doing the same for polygons. So is the polygon that I've just created, is it a woodland? Is it a section of open ground? Is it an orchard? Is it like a recently clear-felled site, or whatever? So descriptions about your points, lines, and polygons are very important. So to kind of like put that into practice, when you're using a Venza, whenever you mark a point, for example, this box pops up and it's going to ask for a place name. So I've added access from the west because I want to say that that is an access point in the woodland. I've then added a photo, And then I've added a description which says access by foot only. And then when I come to export this data on my computer, it will look like a table that says ID1, name access from the west, description access by foot only. So this attribute table is basically describing what I've just created. Yeah, so that's kind of all you need to know about vector models. The very last note on it is an introduction to some file formats. So vector data, so remember that's your points and your lines and your polygons, can be stored in lots of different ways. And I guess unfortunately or fortunately, there's quite a lot of ways in which you can store this information. And I guess when you're getting started, it can be confusing because often when you're in like MyForest, or if I'm in QGIS, or if I'm in Avenza, when I go to export the data, it will give me a list of file formats and how I want to export it. And that's often very confusing. So you don't need to remember these, but the aim is for you to just get familiar with what they are and what they might be. And so you can kind of start to make like an educated guess on how you might export the data. So shapefile is one of the most common ones. There's also something called KML, or keyhole markup language, and then also GeoJSON. So again, if we take an example, so I'm in Avenza, I've created my points, which we just looked at. And now I want to export the layers. So I've clicked export on Avenza, and it pops up with this menu option. So the first one that pops up is KML, which we've just seen, the keyhole markup language. And this holds vector data, and this is the file format in which I suggest if you're using Avenza that you export your data in. So it's the first one that comes up, so it's quite easy to remember. It's good because you can open it in QGIS or in MyForest and make like a shapefile out of it. But you can also open it in Google Earth. So if you are just wanting to map with Avenza and then just kind of store the KMLs on your laptop, and all you want to do is be able to read them, then you can open them in Google Earth, and that's quite easy to do and simple, and kind of most colleagues will be able to do that. The next file format is a CSV, and this is basically like an Excel table. You can turn this into a vector if it has coordinates attached to it, but it's kind of not automatically a vector. So I'd say like ignore CSV for just now and don't need to worry about it. GPX also stores vector data, but it only stores points and lines and not polygons. So again, I'd say ignore it for just now. The geo package, which I've actually not highlighted here, the JPKG, that stands for geo package, and it's kind of like a way of storing a lot of files in like one package, and it's something that we're not going to go into today. And then there's SHP, which stands for shapefile, and this is the kind of like standard format in which vector data is stored in traditional GIS. And ideally this would be how you export data from Avenza, but because it's only available on the paid version, I'm not advising that, and I'm saying select KML when you get to this menu. One final note on like vectors and file formats is if you are using shapefiles, so yeah, a lot of you might not use these very often, but if you are using QGIS, or if someone in your organization has used QGIS before, and there's a mapping folder on your filing system, every shapefile has 5 individual files attached to it, and these all do different things. So one is storing location information, one is storing information about the shape, and one is storing tables, so the attribute descriptive information that we just talked about. And they're all doing different things, and you need all of them. So if you ever stumble across shapefiles, the kind of take-home message is don't delete any of them and don't rename any of them. They all kind of have to stay together and stay with the exact same name. So that's your vector model. That's us representing the real world as points, lines, and polygons. The other most common model is called raster models. And this is where the real world is represented as individual cells, and each of these little cells has a value attached to it. So the main raster file that you'll probably be working with is your satellite imagery base map. This is a raster file. They have descriptive information. So in this example, each of these colored cells has a value, and it's kind of holding a color pretty much. Another typical example is like an elevation model, which is where every single cell represents the height at that particular location. They are, you're going to be working with them less frequently than vector models, but they're useful because they represent kind of continuous data or display kind of like high detailed images such as photographs with kind of like intricate blending, which is useful. The typical raster file formats that you'll see are GeoTIFFs or JPEGs or PNGs. There's kind of a lot of examples, but kind of GeoTIFF will probably be the main one that you'll hopefully maybe become familiar with. So that's the vector model covered and the raster model covered. And when you're using GIS, you're often using these two models together. And how you use these two models together is often called layer-based thinking, which is kind of a descriptive, I guess, term for just adding different layers together and stacking them on top of each other, like what's happened here, and moving them about and toggling them on and off and styling them differently. So here's an example. This is my map. These are all the layers that I have on the map. And I've put the raster layers at the bottom, which is my satellite imagery. And then on top of that, I've put all of my vector layers. And then I've styled them uniquely. And I've put the species layer, like at the bottom of the vector layers. And then on top of that, I've put my paths. And then on top of that, I've put any infrastructure, because if they were below the polygons, they'd be kind of hidden. So there's kind of best practice for how you layer different layers in a GIS system that is kind of intuitive and doesn't need much explaining, to be honest. So that's kind of enough on files and models and kind of potentially familiar to some of you, potentially completely new terminology to others. Any questions at this stage? No, not yet. Cool. So producing maps. Yeah, so GIS, a very powerful tool, can do lots of complicated analysis, but as we talked about last week, most of what you're going to be using GIS for is creating simple maps, and this might be for your felon licenses or your forestry plans, information notes, maps about access, maps that you're going to give to your contractors or whatever. And by creating these maps or by using GIS, you're able to calculate areas very easily, which can help with grant applications. You're able to calculate road lengths or fence lengths or path lengths, which is needed if you're going to be calculating how expensive an upgrade of a road will be, or a new deer fence. And it also allows you to plan your woodland management work. So when you're starting to make a map, I guess the first thing to think about is, what is the map showing you, and what's the key information that you want to communicate with it. So different maps need different emphases. So a woodland creation map, I guess, will mainly be showing your planting areas, but it might also show fence lines, like installation of stock fence or gates. Your constraints map will show hazards or features that might constrain or limit your woodland management. A felon map will show compartments that you plan to fell and the felon year. And then path maps will show paths clearly, different grades, how long it takes to complete a certain circuit in your woodland or whatever. In some cases, and actually in most cases when it comes to forestry, a single map will get too messy and you need to start thinking about creating multiple different maps with different themes. So if we take a forest plan, for example, you might want to create 6 different maps or 7 different maps that link to this forest plan. So this might be your location map, kind of concept map, which kind of describes, I guess, your intentions behind the management of the forest and explaining some of the decisions that you're making, and a compartment and species map. And these will all introduce the forest and show what's there. And then you might also have a felon map and a thinning map to show what you're going to take out of the forest and how you're going to restock it. And then how you're going to restock it, so a restock map. And these 3 maps kind of communicate your management plan objectives, I guess. And you might also want to have a constraints map, which shows limitations or hazards or protective features or whatever. So I'd say ideally the purpose of the map will be trying to communicate 1 or 2 things. And then when the map starts to become too cluttered, then you might want to decide to create a new map. Yeah, I've definitely been at some community consultations and they've printed out like big A0 maps and they've just been so confusing. And anyone that's come into the consultation kind of needs like a 5-minute explanation on what the map's trying to show them. So keeping them kind of as clear and as thematic as possible is advised.
Alice, could I ask a timely question there? Just where across you've got, can you duplicate? So say you've got the location map, can you then duplicate it so that you can then create the concept map? Or do you have to start from scratch again?
By duplicate, yeah, no, you don't need to start by scratch. You're basically just toggling on and off layers. Yeah,
Perfect.
so it's, yeah, so it's quite easy to do. So yeah, last week we touched on design basics and we kind of covered the importance of having titles and legends and north arrows and scale bars and all of that. So we're going to go through this in a bit more detail on kind of why you might choose to make certain decisions. So base maps is often where you start. You kind of need a background, I guess, to start to build up your map. And base maps are often raster files, as we just covered, and they're often images or photographs. So they're stored as kind of like raster data. Most of the softwares, so like Avenza or MyForest or like other paid softwares, they'll have 3 base maps built in. This is the OpenStreetMap base map and this is the Avenza base map. These tend to be pretty basic. They don't show that many features. There's often like big areas like here that kind of are continuous blobs, but you can kind of assume in reality there's a lot of like vegetation changes or maybe there's field boundaries that we're not seeing. The Avenza map has contours, which is quite useful, but the OpenStreetMap doesn't. And I've used OpenStreetMap base maps for felon licenses before, and that has been good enough quality, but there'll be some examples where it's not, and you'll need to kind of explore other base map options. So one alternative is satellite maps. Example of Google Satellite and Bing Satellite. Satellite imagery is really useful in forestry. It basically allows you to look at or readjust boundaries, see any new tracks that have been built, map wind blow. They're often kept fairly up to date nowadays. Also allows you to find quite interesting features like rig and furrows, which might be, I guess, I mean, yeah, you should pick them up if you're doing survey work, but you can also see them quite easily from satellite imagery and you might want to like protect them or need to protect them as a landscape feature. They're exporting maps with satellite imagery is kind of not necessarily advised. I'm going to go into the kind of copyright around Google Satellite and Bing Satellite. But Google Satellite in particular has quite restrictive copyright associated with it. Bing's slightly more flexible. But I guess the main thing is it's quite a lot of detail. That means that any features that you've mapped, so any points, lines, and polygons, can kind of be lost. And the kind of advice is to use a kind of more basic base map. But they're really good to use like in a GIS platform. So they're really good to help you map, basically. So Ordnance Survey is an example of another base map. Everyone's fully familiar with Ordnance Survey. It's kind of the national mapping authority for Great Britain. So if you use Ordnance Survey base maps, they are kind of immediately recognizable and familiar and viewed as a kind of like professional and credible base map. They've been professionally created, so we can kind of assume that the location of field boundaries and roads and paths, etc., are reliable and accurate. And the quality is also very clear. There's a standard in terms of how they add labels and use symbology. That's has been well thought out. So yeah, you might want to consider buying OS-based maps if you're, say, submitting forestry grant scheme applications to Scottish Forestry or working with local authorities. This is a 4 kilometre by 4 kilometre image that I bought for a woodland group, and it cost about £20 for a year license. And then that means I can freely use it on any map production. And you purchase it from an OS partner. There's a lot of them out there. These are some suggestions: the ukmapcentre.com, Esri UK, One Spatial, Land Data Services, and ProMap. And you basically go onto their website, and they should have, I know the top two have like a kind of interactive map, and you highlight the area that you want, and then they'll tell you how much it's going to cost, and you purchase it, and then they'll send you an email within like 20 minutes with the base map. So it's pretty quick. Yeah, so to expand on copyright, which we kind of covered last week, and I kind of brushed up on my knowledge a bit more because I'd kind of forgotten some of it. The free versions, OpenStreetMap and OS Open Data products. These are free to use, and any maps that you export are free to distribute, but you should acknowledge the source. So that means in your bottom corner or in your top corner of your map, you basically just say OpenStreetMap or OS Open Data products. For satellite imagery, Google Satellite Imagery, you can use it in GIS platforms. So I can use it in, say, QGIS. But you can only export maps if you're using them for internal sharing, and you're not allowed to redistribute maps without having a license or specific permission, which you have to get by contacting Google directly. With Bing Satellite Imagery, there's slightly more flexibility. I'm not sure why, but you can use Bing in, say, QGIS, and I can export maps with it, and I can share these. But the kind of limitation is that you can only share them on a small scale. So there's some ambiguity, I guess, in what is a small scale, but I'd kind of assume that submitting them to Scottish Forestry would be fine. But kind of, yeah, common sense is kind of needed, I guess. And then for Ordnance Survey maps, you have to buy a license, and you purchase and you do this by basically like purchasing the area that you want from an OS partner, like we just talked about. So that's base maps. Moving on to symbology, and just to provide a bit more detail from what we covered last week. When you're choosing symbology for your maps, you want to avoid using too many colors, and you kind of want to make your color choices fit for purpose. So in forestry, best practice is if you're mapping conifers, you want to use green and blue colors. If you're mapping broadleaves, you want to use brown and orange colors, like here. If you're mapping other land, so an area of land that's not going to be planted on, you want to use kind of like a light yellow. And if you're mapping any other land, so if there's any land within your forest, like ownership boundary, that's not part of an application, then that's mapped as grey. Labels. We discussed labels last week as well a little bit, and they allow you to add comments to your map and kind of create more detail. I guess you want to avoid overloading the map with labels, and you want the text to be clear and concise. So this is a concept design map for a new woodland creation scheme that was submitted to Scottish Forestry, and its purpose is to kind of explain the thinking behind the design. So that's why there's a lot of labels on this map. So that's labels. One of the other things you might want to do is add additional data to your map. So this might be environmental data, and this will help you understand what is already on site, and I guess ultimately allow you to make better forest management planning and decision making. So data that you might want to add is priority habitats, to understand if there's any kind of habitat constraints or conservation constraints. You might want to add soil data to understand what the soil conditions are. You should definitely, particularly for new woodland creation sites, do soil surveys, but the soil data allows you to kind of have a broad brush, like initial understanding of what's there. You might want to look at the geology to kind of understand drainage limitations on site and how stable your soils might be. And then you might also want to access biodiversity data to see if there's, say, any curlews within within your forest, and how you should be protecting them. Other data that you might want to add are data about potential risks or constraints on site. So utility networks, you obviously want to avoid them and not damage them. So having access to where utilities are and adding these onto your maps is very useful. Archaeology, there are thousands of archaeological sites across Scotland. These might be field systems or hill forts or standing stones or artifacts. And all of these require sensitive management, and you should be creating like open ground buffer zones around them, or plan and operational work sensitively to make sure that you preserve them and don't damage them. I think this is actually an image of a charcoal production site in, I think, Callender. You might also want to add river data. So any forestry operational work must protect river courses and water sources. So it's important to understand where these are, and locating them and adding them onto a map early allows you to make sure that they're protected. You might want to add data about access. So this might be in a layer on timber transport networks. Don't know if most of you will probably know this, but there's kind of agreed timber transport routes across the whole of Scotland. And the aim of these are to try and reduce the impact of timber transport on public roads and to local communities and on the environment. And so kind of looking at where these are, and if they're close to your forest, and if you're planning to fell timber, or if you're designing a new woodland creation scheme with a productive element, how is someone going to be able to take the timber out in 30, 40, 50 years time? You might want to add information about roads. So the Ordnance Survey map that we were just looking at, that comes with road networks on, but you can also add vector files of road data, and that allows you to kind of manipulate the data in a way that you can if you just have the Ordnance Survey base map. So it allows you to like make certain roads thicker on your map, or change colors if you want to like highlight particular features or whatever. And then you can also add path data. So this can be useful if you want to like plan walking routes around your woodland. So all that data that I just mentioned, all of it is freely available. Sourcing data, but it's a lot of data and it's a lot of information. And sourcing and kind of downloading and like adding data to your maps, it's quite time consuming at the start, and it takes time to find where the data is. And I guess I'm just saying that to not berate yourself if you feel like it's going slow. And as time goes on, you get familiar with where the data is and how to access it. And if you just want to view it online on a website, or if you want to download it and store it on your computer and kind of add it to your own maps. Yeah, so these links will be shared in the chat, but they'll also be sent to you afterwards, and you could spend a long time exploring all of these websites. They're full of useful information. Yeah, and I would say just like take your time with exploring all the data that's out there, and yeah, start to become familiar with it. I guess the last thing on that is there's some data in these websites that there's a kind of so say contours, for example. I think you can freely download 10-meter contours, but sometimes you want 5-meter contours or 1-meter contours, and you generally have to pay for that higher level of detail. So with a lot of these data portals, there's like a free version that's more basic, and then there's a paid for version. Yeah, so that's kind of the chunk of what we're covering today, quite like information dense, particularly the start, maybe if you're not familiar with any of the kind of standard GIS terminology, but all important and kind of the building blocks for you to be able to create your own maps. I just wanted to quickly mention some of the common mistakes that people encounter. One of them is data quality issues. GPS points are not always exact. They're probably not going to be exact if you're underneath a dense canopy, but phones can also glitch and add your point in a random place or show that you're somewhere else. If it's kind of a Venza and it normally allows you to see where you are on your map, it might show you 50 meters away from where you are. So I guess whenever you're mapping points, just kind of like ground truth it, and like whenever you're marking lines or polygons, just like double check that it looks right. Data can be out of date. This is something to flag up if you're kind of downloading data from one of those websites that I just mentioned. You want to make sure you are using the most up-to-date version. And then different people record things in different ways. So say you're every year trying to record and monitor the paths in your woodland, and one year someone might go out with their GPS device and mark the paths and say this is of good quality, this is of moderate quality, and this is of poor quality. And then the next year someone else might go out and mark the paths and say this is a bit muddy, this is okay, and kind of use descriptive terms. And then it's kind of confusing to compare the data. So even when you're mapping within an organization, it's good to kind of have standard practice, I guess, of how you record things. There can be human and organizational issues, volunteers and staff change, so a loss of knowledge or data. Generic issues around storing data, things get deleted, things get lost, laptops break, stuff isn't saved. And then version quality. So like when you're producing reports, there can often be multiple versions of maps. Sometimes I can have like 8 versions of the same maps because someone is constantly asking for a small change to be made, and you kind of want to make sure that you're always working with and sharing the latest version. And then in terms of mapping, you can display too many layers in your map, and then that can make it hard to read. The colour schemes that you can choose can be confusing or unclear, or you might forget to include a title on your map. And these are all, I guess, ways in which your map makes no sense and you kind of want to avoid. Yeah, so my suggestion is to go away and, I guess, try again if you struggled with any of the mapping softwares. And then, as I said at the start, my proposal for next week is to go through MyForest and Avenza. Maybe you can either comment in the chat box or send me an email in the next week if you'd like to go through anything else, and we can see if we can fit it in. And we're going to have a brief talk from Steve from a Community Woodland about how they've approached mapping, so you can kind of like start to see some of the different approaches that Community Woodlands have decided to take. Do you have any questions?
We've got one in the chat, Alice, from Neville, who's asking, are there sites where you can download high quality backgrounds? Often if working in QField offline, the background can be really low quality if you transfer to Google or Bing backgrounds as a static image.
So yeah, Neville, I actually have never used QField. I've downloaded the app, I think 5 times, and then always ended up deleting it because I never got around to using it. So I actually don't know about compatibility with QField. I would be surprised if you can't upload like a GeoTIFF or like a georeferenced PDF if you've made it in, I'm assuming you're using QGIS.
Yes, yeah. What I found is that when I if I just choose to use the Google satellite as the background when I create the QField project,
yeah,
when you actually get out in the field, it's fine if you've got signal and you can live update, but if you haven't, then what I find is that you get this really poor quality image,
yeah,
and it's effectively you're recording blind.
yeah,
Now I talked to a colleague a while ago and he said, oh, I know that area, I can give you a really high quality background. And sure enough, I used that as a static image. And, you know, it was crystal clear where I was on the map, and I could see I was recording in the right place and so on and so on. But I don't know where he got that. And I don't know if there's a open source for that type of imagery, or whether, as you say, whether it's the type of file I've downloaded or the resolution of the file I've transferred, maybe.
yeah. I mean, you should be able to use OpenStreetMap in, you can definitely use it in QGIS. So I'd be surprised if you can't select it as an option in QField. Or I would buy a tile from Ordnance Survey for that area and then add it to QGIS and then export it as a PDF and add it.
Okay. Okay. Other quick question for Alice was, if you're recording a shapefile, this goes back to the whole thing what you're saying about file management and keeping all things in the same place and not changing the name. If you wanted to go and sort of extend your survey or something like that, let's say like somebody else was saying they want to record invasives. Let's say there's another invasive that hadn't occurred to them to record previously. Can you go back out with your phone app or QField or whatever and extend that survey without having to set up a new project? Or would you have to start another project?
In QField, you can do that, yeah. Yeah. But I guess what a lot of people, if they're not using QField, they would kind of replot the areas in Avenza or on Google Maps and then send that data to themselves and then kind of update the file on the computer. But in QField, you're able to update the file directly, if that makes sense.
Because I thought you could only package and sync with QField once in each project, but maybe not.
I thought you could do it multiple times, but maybe I'm wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's what I wasn't sure about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
can double check and and feel free to email me if that doesn't make sense, and I can look into it.
Thank you.
Alice, Jack's put a couple of questions in the chat, or the same question, continuation. My main intention is to create a map of interest and use to visitors. Not sure what to put on it. Got an annual OS subscription. Not sure what I can do with it other than download current area map to a phone.
Yeah, so the OS subscription, Jack, is that just like the OS app that you have on your phone?
Yes, as far as I can tell, it lets me download the whole country, download the whole country's maps, or download parts of them to their areas to my phone if I go out wandering. I don't know what else it gives me. I thought it was a really good idea at first, 10 years ago when I moved here, but I've hardly used it since.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess for those who don't know, OS have their own app, and it's really great to use if you're hill walking or whatever. You can have offline maps and it shows you where you are, so it's really easy to navigate. My understanding is you can't like export, or it doesn't give you permission to export kind of like tiles, and then so you can't like update them, you can't like add them onto a different system. You can only access it within their app. So it's not that useful if you want to create your own map. It doesn't really allow you to do that. If you're wanting to make a map of interest and use to visitors, are you wanting to export it as a PDF and kind of have it on your website, or?
Yes, both on the website and also to print it out in big notice boards, say at the entrances to the woodland.
Yeah, so I'd maybe encourage you to just do it in two ways. I'd either encourage you to do it in My Forest, or next week I'm going to show you some lists of people that make quite engaging maps they kind of specialize in orienteering and creating maps for orienteering competitions around the country. And they make, and there's like kind of 10 or 12 different companies, and they specialize in making really engaging and really easy to use maps that are suitable for notice boards or leaflets. Because a lot of what we're covering so far in terms of like how to make maps, they're not necessarily engaging enough to be like on a big notice board. And that's another kind of core reason why community woodlands might want to make maps. So if that's your purpose, I'd kind of recommend you outsource it to a company that's their specialization. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. One other thing, we've got a bit of a dilemma in that we're arguing between ourselves. There are one or two comparatively rare plants up on our woodland, and some of us say, don't let anybody know, we make sure we protect that area. And the other half of us say, people will want to know and go and see these bits. So I have to have two maps and give one to each time for people.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's open to the floor about what people think. Yeah, and I mean, that's a whole topic in mapping in itself. Like, what I remember having lectures on what's the danger of map making, and like how can maps be used for like not good intent, or or manipulated in a certain way. So it's definitely something to think about. Like, do you want everyone to know where a rare plant is, or do you not? And I guess you can kind of only make that decision as a group.
Alice, is that something that would be recorded on the likes of an iNaturalist app as well? So it's kind of more an ecological sort of recording rather than it being necessarily a geographical recording.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. But I've heard people also say that about iNaturalist, if there's like a protected species, preferring it not to be recorded on there because anyone can access that information. So it could also be like submitting it to Plant Life or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's also almost at 3. If any other questions do come up in the next week, then definitely feel free to email me. And we talked about creation of a WhatsApp group. I've not done that yet. That's something that maybe I'll do at the end of next week's session, and we can kind of see if that functions. Which is the intention behind that was for anyone who wasn't here last week, was to have a WhatsApp group that if you have any quick fire mapping questions, they can be posted on there, and either myself or anyone else could maybe answer them, in recognition that sometimes it's quite quick to answer your question, but there's maybe like a balance between, like, this is a complicated topic and it does take a while to get confident and quick at it, and when is it suitable to access like more thorough training or pay someone to do the mapping. Yeah.
Alice, could I ask if you could move on the next slide, please?
Yes.
So folks,
Feedback.
just as last week, is not so much feedback, but more it's that insight form. Just if something's come up for you, I'll put the link in the chat. If something has come up for you that you would like Alice to look at next week, or further questions. I noticed faces were far more intense this week, Alice, than they were last week, and I think and certainly I was more intense this week because it is starting to get that little bit more complicated and a bit more complex. So I'm sure questions will pop up for you. Please share. If something's been really helpful, please share. It's always good to get that kind of feedback. But if there's something you'd like to unpick a little bit more, then just use that form, and then Alice has got it in a collated space that she can address it for next session. I think, Alice, what we'll also do as well is we'll share the PDFs of both of these last sessions. And I'm also going to do the editing now of this recording. So you should have that by the end of the day as well.
Yeah,
so
definitely. Yeah.
If not, it'll be sooner rather than later, certainly sooner this week than it was last.
Yeah,
so,
and if you can all wait, I guess the intention is to maybe send all the PDFs at the end with supporting material, links and suggested reading and things like that. So that will come at after next Thursday.
Okay. Perfect, folks. Well, if you've got no more further questions for now, thank you very much for joining us again on today's session. And we look forward to seeing you again next week at the same time. Take care, folks.
Thanks, everyone.